And so Clare comes to London and is split horribly between having to present himself in London as a peasant poet when he meets De Quincey and Coleridge and so on, and is a turn, like I'm being a turn now, but it wasn't natural to him. He couldn't do it, and he goes mad, and he ends up in an asylum on the edge of the city, and then goes off for this phenomenal piece of prose, as it turns out, a 3.5-day walk back to the village he'd come from, not knowing where he was going, just ambling up the Great North Road, going to sleep at night by putting his head to the north, to the star, and setting himself up in the same direction in the morning, with nothing to eat, chewing grass, chewing tobacco, and trying to reconnect with his muse, Mary Joyce, who was in fact dead, a woman he'd known in his youth, a rich farmer's daughter who is now dead and has been burnt and is gone. So he's coming to meet a dead person. And who does come out to meet him is his real wife, his temporal wife, on a cart, takes him on board. He hardly recognizes them, and shortly thereafter goes into an asylum in Northampton where he spends the rest of his life. And he begins to write in other personas. He writes as Lord Byron. He writes as everybody else, because there is no John Clare. That open field thing has gone. And I think in the same way we need to hold desperately to the idea of the open field poetic, to that way of reading the world. I mean, when I tried at the same time as a student, an American professor, an academic, turned up in Dublin and was giving a lecture on what he thought was the significant aspects of American poetry. He didn't mention Olson at all, and at the end of this I just got up and asked him, what about Charles Olson? And he snorted, and all he could say was, ego like a lantern. And I thought, well, actually, this is not a bad thing. Ego like a lantern? You mean, throwing illumination on the world? Yes, what else should an ego be, And this, unfortunately, was the kind of exchange we were getting. The overshadowing event of all of these things that we were leading up to is the end of the local in London. The place I live is a series of small villages that connect, that have grown up because of their geography, which is another thing you learn from that Olson poetic, that where you are is everything, that the geography, the geology informs and describes and sets it up. That the place where I am grew up because there was a river called the Hackney Brook, which ran out of the River Lee, an important tributary of the Thames, and it curved across to Highgate Hill. And it's exactly the territory that William Blake describes in Jerusalem. He actually lists a journey, an imaginary journey, down from Highgate Hill that goes exactly in the path of this river, which he would have known, and comes out at Stratford and then through to the narrows of the river's side. Well, that journey, that sort of psychosomatic journey, that dream journey, becomes a journey I would do all the time. And you would see that the growth of this city comes from that thing which is now lost because the river itself has been enclosed. It's buried in the ground. It's gone. You can't see it. But you still feel its presence enormously. But the River Lee that it led into was the border for London. It was the border between the kind of inhabited London and this wildernessy London away to the east. It was marshland. It was industrial land because the Lee had led into the second industrial revolution. There was an invention of plastics. There were big gin mills, there was fish processing, a lot of fish processing. All of those things, the kind of industrial things that you see a lot of in New England, they all grew up in this area. And there were also parks that had been given, people's parks in the mid-19th century, because all of the London parks, the royal parks, had a kind of protected atmosphere. And they wanted a park for the east end of London because there was so much overcrowding, so much disease, that some open space was required, an open field, an area, and they gave a park there. So all of that was wonderfully beneficial, and there were swimming pools and there were just ponds on there in which the kids who never got to see the sea got to swim, and it was actually not only a place for the health and recreation of the people in East London, it also gave a space for walks, meditation, quietness. Well, all of that suddenly has been totally destroyed by the eruption of the grand project, which is the huge Olympic Games, which is an economic global conglomerate landing, invading a strip of ground. And what we saw on the back of this was enclosure. Once again, overnight, very tall blue fences appeared around this landscape where people had been free to wander for so long, used by fishermen. And the biggest corruption in the whole process was language. You know, Olson would have ripped this apart in the local papers. This is language that is corrupted. It is the opposite. It's mirror words. It's the opposite of what it actually is. What the proposal was, that what we're doing here is rescuing a wilderness where there was nothing. Well, actually, there was everything. You know, there were businesses that thrived. There were camps of travelers and gypsies. There were a lot of artists had moved into the old warehouses of the previous industrial age and had formed communities that were thriving. In the 19th century, a guy who owned a pub made his own Olympic Games at the back of his pub. He just got a cinder track, and he used the new railway embankments for the crowd, and he invited some Native American runners to come over and challenge the English champions. He got people from all over the world into this. He created a miniature Olympic Games entirely at his own expense. He made enough money to give some of the residue to the Lancashire cotton workers. You know, this is how good it was. And then people came into the same area from the Oxford colleges and created missions and bought playing fields. They bought colleges where art was taught and sewing and pool and everything else was going on there. All the stuff that was actually there has been allowed to be destroyed. And the 14 local small swimming pools have all gone to put money into one mega aquatic centre. And the only food you're allowed to buy in this whole zone comes from McDonald's. And the only water even you can get has to come from Coca-Cola, who are the sponsors. And the net result of it all is a huge Australian shopping mall, which is the only access to the Olympic track. You know, so it's a kind of a nightmare. And I was asked to take a voyage on a boat through this landscape and make some kind of presentation on the boat, which would also involve film. And this is where we finish off, because it brings me back to Charles Olson. And I'd just been listening to a recording of the Gold Machine, and that really hit me. And I thought, we'll fold all this together. You know, what we've got here is a kind of voyage like Walter Raleigh going off to search for gold in the jungles. It's a bit like Werner Herzog and Fitzgeraldo. And beyond that, there was some journals of my great-grandfather who had lost all his money, and he went off to Peru, and he was exploring the headwaters of the Amazon. And I realized they were exactly the same places that I was reading about in Herzog's journal of the making of Fitzgeraldo. So all of that, and then underneath it all was the Olson poem, The Gold Machine, which is about alchemy. It's about taking the mud and muck and dirt of this industrial zone and trying to make a fool's gold out of it. And the Olsonian thing is double-edged. It's about alchemy, which he was interested in through Jung, but it's also about what he witnessed of the hoovering up of the machinery that produces gold out in California. And so there are these various elements in a short text I did and presented and read on the boat. And I should say that there's one other aspect to it, is before you were allowed on a boat that went through your own territory where I'd lived all my life, they asked you to produce your passport. And there was eyeball recognition. This is to go on a boat through Hackney. I call this the Gold Machine. It is a dream for those condemned to live within the belly of the beast, to venture in search of El Dorado, the fabulous city of gold. Water is our margin, the zone in which all stories tangle and overlap, rivers of no return, unmapped and therefore unimagined, water greener than grass. Coming away from solid ground, we risk everything. We cannot know what is hidden behind the curtain of foliage, the high blue fence, that blue sudden flash of a kingfisher whose secret life has been protected by the obscurity of a post-industrial terrain. Flesh-eating plants in a vegetable kingdom, cathedral-like forest enclosures lit by the diamond eyes of predatory beasts, jaguars, anacondas, summoned in aerosol spray paint visions on brick walls. We're chugging on our boat towards oblivion with nothing to guide us but a set of ambiguous postcards scavenged from a street market at dawn one damp October morning in London. London, unsure of itself, dissolves into Peru, into Africa, Thames, Congo, Amazon. We drift down the tributary of a tributary until we succeed in losing ourselves and our familiar markers, radar beams by which we navigate, alchemists of ruin trying to convert contaminated soil into a golden legacy, speculators in futurity. I am the gold machine, said the poet Charles Olson, and now I have trenched out, smeared, occupied with my elongated length the ugliest passage of all, the V, the uncontaminated land which does not bend or warp into new expressions of itself as De Sitter imagined the universe, a rubber face or elastic bands falling into emergent lines. The land was relieved. I had drawn my length all this way and had covered this place too. Security checks, passports, fingerprints, eyeball identification. We must be certain you are who you say you are. Our guardians will shadow your slender craft, bearing weapons protecting you from false images. Joseph Conrad returns ruined to the German hospital in Graham Road in Hackney. This is the true thing. After his expedition up the Congo, when he becomes malarial and sick and diseased, he returns to Hackney, of all places, and he goes into what was a German hospital with all his diaries and photographs of the Congo journey, where he cooks it up into Heart of Darkness. But meanwhile, the real Heart of Darkness is all around him, because in the same street in Graham Road in Hackney, a woman starves to death at that time because she's lost her job and is too ashamed to go out and solicit other work or beg, and she just stays in her room and doesn't eat and just fades away and dies. That's what's going on around it. Joseph Conrad endures the transformation from a sailor to a writer. His single journey up the Congo River ruined his health, leaving him with a legacy of physical ailments, the lingering after effects of near-fatal dysentery and malaria, on which he blamed a variety of chronic and recurrent forms of paralysis, nervous disorders, and gout. Sir Walter Raleigh, who had been imprisoned in the Tower of London, a short distance upstream from the point where the River Lee flows into the Thames, risked his reputation on a doomed voyage up the Orinoco in quest of El Dorado. May 1595, a map as fantastic as the computer-generated projections of the Olympic promoters and just as unreliable. Raleigh received royal permission for this voyage. There should be tangible rewards in the forms of Guianan gold. The expedition was a fiasco. Raleigh returned from a second visit to South America, a broken man, facing almost certain execution. It was as if it had been foretold by the ferocious Aguirre a century earlier. There's nothing on this river but despair. My own great-grandfather, Arthur Sinclair, had his reserves swallowed in poor investments and a plague that decimated the tea plantations. So he went after gold in Tasmania before venturing out onto the upper reaches of the Amazon. This is his journal. A woman and 2 children were tumbled off the raft and drowned. No one enjoyed it more than the woman's husband, who danced with fiendish glee the whole night through, encouraged by the screaming laughter of the ladies. Once more upon the river, we were all alive with excitement. Several tributaries fall in. One, the Ipuki, adds palpably to the depth and force of the Perrine, upon which we are carried at about 5 miles an hour. Denser and denser became the forest, now no longer relieved by patches of grassy land. And the question here naturally arises, why has this rich country been allowed to remain from the creation to the present day in a wild and desolate condition? It is no man's land. It has never been taken possession of, and the present nomadic tribes recognize no laws and no government. Are men always to despair of utilizing this marvelous vegetation, to be forever overwhelmed by the excessive bounty of nature? Surely the time will come, or soon will come, when this, the richest portion of the globe, will no longer be entirely left to nature, oh dear, and the few wandering tribes utterly incapable of making proper use of it. The impulse comes from both sides to cultivate and improve wilderness, and also to maintain it as it stands, dirty, unexplained. There are those who feel the obligation to bear witness, to turn when the land is captured to the back rivers and to the secret streams. On my next walk to Hackney Wick, I ran up against that blue fence. An exclusion zone had been declared, and the only way now was in by water. Meeting the photographer Stephen Gill at Old Ford Lock, we made a secret slow circuit in an inflatable kayak. witnessing the pylon forests being dismantled, the warehouses and the small businesses reduced to rubble. We paddled through tunnels of intertwined and overhanging vegetation, and we were noticed, but we were not challenged by the work gangs. We understood very well that even this privilege would soon be suspended. Thank you.